Hi there, my name is Aubrey and I'm an opera singer and a voice coach. Today I wanted to try something a little bit different and practice speaking into a mic. I really haven't done that too often, but it could be a nice way to diversify my content, just simply from a production point of view. So today I really wanted to spend some time chatting about Renée Fleming's recent interview where she discusses the US voice programs because it's really come out and caused quite a bit of a stir in the community. There's a lot of people who have come out in support of what she said. There's a lot of people who have come out and made very valid criticisms of what she said. So, in order to get in on the discourse and hopefully encourage people who hang out on my YouTube channel to also participate, I thought it would be fun to read through a small sample of the interview and then give some thoughts, perhaps go through some other people's comments and such. So, without further ado, let's look into Renée Fleming on the US Voice Program. She says, given the climate right now for opera and classical music performance, which is what I know, I think there are far too many universities and colleges taking money from young people who shouldn't be. I'm sorry, but it's true. And what's criminal about it is that, somebody recently said to me, there should be an antitrust suit. These kids will all have debt, terrible debt, when they get out of school. I used to give master classes at small schools. I don't anymore, but I've done it. And sure, there's the occasional miraculous talent. But even those students, if they don't get on the right track quickly by their late 20s, the possibilities start to decline significantly. And then I hear people who really have no business majoring in voice, but the schools take them anyways. I once asked someone at a major conservatory, how do you sleep at night? I know that was a bit harsh, but he said, well, a lot of people use that degree to go on and then major in something else. And I thought, wow, given what secondary education costs, that's a bit rich. Now, overarchingly, I really do agree with her sentiment here, but I just want to point out one of the early things she brings up is that when we talk about the climate for opera and classical music, I think what she's trying to say is that perhaps there's a waning interest, but I don't personally see that. At least where I live, there's a very vibrant community of people who are excited about classical music, intrigued by it, and I think depending on how you market yourself and how you connect with your community, that's ultimately going to decide whether or not you have a successful career, at least from a middle-class artist kind of standpoint, or a local artist. I myself don't necessarily sit in a sphere where I'm internationally recognized by any means, and that's okay by me. I've really thought a lot about what my identity as a local artist is and what that looks like, diversifying myself and my interests and my relationship to other members in the community. All of that really defines me as a singer. And for my personal goals, I've never necessarily imagined myself being like Renée Fleming. I have always really loved being involved in my community on a more personal level. Traveling around, going to all these different houses, as exciting as that might be, I'm not sure if it would make me happy. So depending on what kind of artist you are, your relationship to classical music and its success in your area might look different than what she's alluding to. So I just wanted to get that out of the way first. One of the other things that I think she brings up, but doesn't really go into, at least not in this quote, is this idea that music and the creation of music needs to fit under capitalism's definition of success. And what I mean by that is if you're not booking lots of gigs, if you're not paying your bills full time with music, if you're not making that money, if you're not making those albums, it doesn't equate to you being a successful musician. And I think that oversimplifies what our careers can look like. And I think that also negates the possibility for creation outside of profit. And to be very fair, this is more indicative actually of our industry's serious decline than it is anything else. Because obviously we need to feed ourselves, we need to pay our rent, so making a profit isn't a crime. But to ignore the fact that one of the major reasons why we make art in the first place before we start our careers is because we deeply love it. And not only that, that we would do it regardless of whether we get paid, and oftentimes do. It really puts us into this position where you can see the problem, which is that we're a really easy to exploit group. It's so easy for companies or schools to see that energy in us and see it as an opportunity for them to make a massive profit, because it just becomes a symptom of the bigger problem, which is worker exploitation, which isn't necessarily unique to our career field, but is very, very obvious in this career field. And going off of that, right, a lot of the times when people are talking about quality singers, I do find it a little bit funny, because if she's saying, well, there are singers that are just not up to snuff in these programs, my question to her would be, then why do we have any educational programs at all? If the place to go and learn how to sing is not a school, and if you are expected to go to a school and already have all of your technique ready and sound, as she says, miraculous, then the question then becomes, is school actually doing anything for students? Because if everyone is supposed to sound perfect and ready for work, then where do all the people who are looking to learn go? And that ties back to my previous point, is if we're only making art for money, then we completely disregard the existence of making art for fun, or making art for connection, or making art for emotional expression. There are a million reasons as to why we all make art. And I think by turning it into, well, you're either good enough to be paid or you shouldn't do it, I personally think there's nothing wrong with being someone who's interested in singing and then going to a school in order to get better, because I just feel like that's how it should be. But in a lot of our programs, that really hasn't been the case for a long time. They're kind of looking for people who don't need a lot of work. They're looking to hone in other skills and get you onto the stage as soon as possible. Like she said, by your late 20s, you should probably already be getting these kinds of gigs in order to see your career blossom, blah, blah, blah. I get that, and I see where she's coming from, because if you're looking at it from the realistic perspective, that's what our career has become. And whether or not we like that, that is simply the case. So even though I personally have my own addendum to what she's saying, I agree fundamentally with what she means and the context in which she's speaking, because she's correct. If we only expect our students to go to school because they are on this path, a very specific path, mind you, then that is what we're looking for in a student, and there's really no space for any other kinds of students, whether they're interested in other genres or styles of singing, or perhaps other kinds of careers that aren't necessarily that main stage to the Met kind of path. So I definitely see what she's saying, largely agree with it, but I wanted to add that alternative perspective of, if we're not thinking about it in reality, right, and we're imagining it in a more perfect world, then we can also say that perhaps the school system is not just problematic because it's taking singers that aren't ready for the Met, but also because it's not creating a system to help singers become better, if that makes sense. Next, she kind of talks about this debt problem, and I just really want to point out that charging so much for an education is not unique to singers, but rather all students in America, and that is something that a lot of people are just not willing to engage on. And I think that's a huge shame, because this debt burden is really preventing young people from being able to take off, whether it's purchasing homes, starting families, being able to start businesses, being able to take risks in their careers. All of these things are being dragged down by the anchor around our necks, which is school debt. That being said, I also see debt being used as a bit of a weapon against the idea of going into the arts. It almost has become a reason to encourage people to avoid going into anything that's not essentially STEM. And I think that that also is not helpful, because not all of us can be plumbers or businessmen. You know, diversity is what allows society to blossom, and art allows also for workers to find joy and entertainment on their time off. So it's not necessarily the same job as a lawyer or a doctor or an HVAC man, but the positive is it's providing value outside of what would be considered traditionally a service or a product. I also want to point out that Growing up, a lot of us have heard over and over again about what kinds of degrees are quote unquote valuable. And it gets a little bit tiring to hear from these outsiders. And of course, she's not discussing this, so this is a bit of a tangent. But when you hear people say you were just foolish to take on that kind of debt, and of course, I'm making a massive generalization, but to synthesize a lot of commentary I've received myself and heard from other people, I definitely feel like there's a bit of an animosity towards those of us who chose to go into the arts and humanities. I don't know why. I could take guesses, but I think a lot of that is stemming from this idea of placing blame on the student, despite the fact that maybe the student has wonderful talent or passion. The idea of becoming a computer programmer or a government worker is really steeped in the idea of stability. But as we've seen, those careers, even though historically very valuable or extremely reliable careers, are not eternally safe from job loss. If nothing else, the last decade has really shown us that no career is completely untouchable, and that stability is not really much more than an illusion, or at least a temporary state. And perhaps that means we should be focusing more on the things that make us happy. Perhaps that should push us to connect with our communities and ourselves on a deeper level. And even if we don't all become artists, because like I said, not everyone can be only one career, it still should encourage us to be able to explore our hobbies and find joy. There's a lot of different things that this particular interview with Renée Fleming has brought out in me and has really helped me to even think about. As somebody who has done her undergrad, has done her master's, and is now starting a PhD in the subject, I feel very strongly about pursuing passion because life is really short, but it can also be really long. So, life is short when you do something that you really love. Things move so quickly, and next thing you know, it's over. But life can be so painfully long in that same vein if you're doing something that doesn't bring you any joy or any purpose. So, even though there's no right or wrong answer because everybody's life is so unique, I think that this article, not only does it help me to really isolate a lot of the criticisms that I've already felt for many years about the United States educational system, but it also allows me to feel validated in my choice of going into the arts. It's a lot harder than people expect. I think going into your undergrad, perhaps you have no idea what your career will look like, or perhaps you have a very strong understanding of what you think it'll look like, but in reality, it so very rarely goes the way you expect. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys that level of unpredictability, then maybe this is the right career for you. But if you're not ready for that kind of instability, if you're not understanding of the fact that predictability is not going to necessarily come hand in hand with this career choice, then I think there's nothing wrong with pursuing art as something that you do on the side in conjunction with other things that you're passionate about. I think art doesn't need to come only from people who have an undergrad or a master's degree. I think art can come from anywhere, from anybody, and there should be space for that discourse, along with space for what does higher education provide for us who choose to go down that path. I really think this interview is fascinating. I think it's really something that should be brought up because we're at a critical junction in the health of the classical music industry as a business. And I really think that Renée is talking about something that not only she knows a lot about, but she's just trying to actually look at things for what they truly are and not for what they're sold to us as. So I was just really inspired to chat about this interview, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. I am by no means an expert, but as somebody who pays their bills with music exclusively, whether it's teaching or performing, I definitely feel some sort of way when I hear things like this coming out of the woodwork, because although I am well aware of these critiques, nothing she said surprised me or even was anything I haven't talked about before with my own friends. It's just hard to hear. It's just really, really humbling to hear, especially coming from someone that we all largely look up to and see as a beacon of what opera singing is supposed to look like. If we're not willing to talk about what evolution in the classical music industry looks like, then we will go extinct. And I wish I didn't have to say that, but I think moving forward and changing is necessary for every industry, and we're not exempt from that. But I do find a lot of pushback. So perhaps someone as influential and powerful and well respected as Renée Fleming saying some of these things that some of us younger people have been trying to bring to the forefront, perhaps it will do a lot of good for our overall industry. So thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking with me a little bit about this subject. And I would love to hear your thoughts about it. And I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you so much. And as always, keep on singing.